All right. Howdy everyone. Happy Thursday. If you haven't already signed in, please make sure to do so. I will post it one more time in the chat. Those links are exactly the same if you were here when I posted the first time. As I was mentioning, I do not really have a whole lot of content planned for this week. The lesson is pretty short, and I'm happy to answer any questions about either this week or a previous week. Anything you guys are curious about, feel free to ask any questions. And if there are no questions, we can just talk about some random stuff, whatever you guys are into. Any immediate questions? I know Jenny, we had talked about looking at a couple of tests that you were writing. I want to just see if there are any smaller questions first. Go ahead, Olga.
Hi, I have a question. My reviewer is out of country right now, so she was not able to go through my whole code. And I have a question. May I share my screen?
Of course.
The question is about week number 8. Just a second, I'm doing here. It's I think first time. Do you see my screen?
I can see it.
So my question is, what is the expected result of lesson number 8? So I did, it's a little bit confusing. I'll try to remove Zoom. Just this, I'm sorry. I need to remove something from here because I don't see my.
Yeah, the thing on the top is really annoying.
Oh gosh, I'm sorry. How can I? Okay, here it is. So I made an Airtable and I did like a couple of random tasks just to check them. But in my application, I see five of them, but I don't see the text. Is it supposed to be like that, or I was supposed to, or it's not correctly?
I think ideally we should be seeing the title of each task on your page. So there's probably something that's not quite right.
Okay, so I need to fix my code to display all the tasks which were originally in my Airtable.
Yes. So the goal
Okay.
is that anything in your Airtable is what you should be seeing at the exact same moment in your list. So if you remove
Okay.
something from the list, it should remove from Airtable. And if you add something to the list, it should add to Airtable. And then when you load your page for the first time, it should show you everything that's currently.
Thank you. Then I'll just schedule some session to fix the bug because I was not able to do this and I didn't want to wait for my reviewer to come back because it will take. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, a one-on-one mentor will be super helpful. It could be that like you're not reading the value from Airtable properly, or maybe like there's a property that you had a typo and you accidentally typed like one character wrong or something. It could be something really small, hopefully, but they can
Thank
definitely.
you. Thank you.
Hmm. Any other questions? Anything that was confusing or you'd like to review? Okay, if anything comes up, feel free to speak up. We got a long time. Jenny, if you feel comfortable sharing, we can go ahead and look at some of the stuff that you were talking with me about earlier this week.
Hold on, okay.
Yeah, no worries. Any other questions in the meantime?
So, you want me to share or?
Yeah, if you have something that we can try and work through as a group, then I think it would be good to share it and see what's going on.
So I have a test here. I wrote a test which tried to display you click you type the task and then you click the button, and then it will add the task to the list. But I don't. It seemed like my test doesn't seem to work, so I wrote another one. So I guess the other one is not really testing the same thing, but this one seems to pass. So I don't know.
Okay, can you run your test just so we can see what the result is?
Sorry, hold on.
Okay. So 3 of them passed, and then the one that failed is the one that's waiting for your loading text to go away. Okay. So let's look at that test that's failing so that we can
I don't. It was passing the other day, so I don't know what happened here.
yeah, I know you mentioned that it might be flaky, if flaky meaning like a test that passes sometimes but not 100% of the time, just generally not good. Document does not contain elements, but we did find it. Okay, so this test, let's review what's actually going on here. Can you scroll up to the test in your code just a little bit? I think it's
I think this is
yeah,
not the original test I had on this one on 31 on line 31, but I
yeah,
changed it. But
that's okay.
but
Let's
I think
look at
I
the one
wanna.
above it that's currently failing and see if we can figure this one
It's
out. The
this
one
one, I
that starts
think.
on 15.
This one.
Okay, so what we're doing here, just to get everyone on the same page, is writing some tests that actually test the React component to make sure that it's behaving correctly. So in previous weeks, we had talked about writing tests for just like functions and testing inputs and outputs, which is great, but a lot of the stuff that happens in your page happens because you're rendering content. And when that content changes, we need to check to make sure that it's changing the way we would expect. So one such test would be that like if you add a to-do through your form, that it should render a new to-do onto your page. And similarly, if you delete one, then it should take away that element, like when you click the button. And so what Jenny's doing here is she's writing a test where we want to display the task list once we finish loading from Airtable. So we have this testing block, which is very appropriately named, displays task list when loading message disappears. And then we render the app, which should wait for the app to render.
I'm just trying to write some simple one.
Yeah, this is great. We're just going through this in my head. So it looks like you are looking for that loading text on the screen using a regular expression, which is fine. And then we expect it to be in the document, meaning we should see an element, like that line 18 should get an element, and then we expect that that element is going to be rendered somewhere. So that appears to work. And then the one that's failing is on line 26. Um,
Already increase. It seemed like because it sometimes vary like when the loading message disappears. So I kind of increased the timeout, but it still kind of doesn't work here.
yeah. I'm not sure how long Airtable usually takes for everyone. I have very limited experience, but I would expect that in general, it should get back to you within, 1500 milliseconds. Um, I would say like if you're gonna set a timeout like this, I would set something very generous. Like ideally these tests would be running like asynchronously when you push your code to GitHub, in which case you want it to not take forever, but you don't really care that it runs like immediately. Because you'll have like a robot running them for you. So what if we tried bumping that up to like 10 seconds? So instead of 1500, we do 10 and then 3 zeros. Or 1 and 4 zeros. So that's 100, yeah. And then that's 1 second, 10 seconds. I think a lot of times timeouts for stuff involving web requests are usually like 60 seconds, which is a little excessive here.
Like,
But I think 10 seconds should be a good buffer. And then could we try running this test a couple more times just to see what happens? Display
it
test.
happened randomly. It's just not like it doesn't happen like if you test it right now, it
Hmm.
works, but then it's sometimes it just doesn't work. I
So
guess
it's still failing even after
yeah.
the
Test the no, why?
That's interesting. Test timeout after 5 seconds. Okay, so that's a different error. So we have some setting somewhere that fails tests after 5 seconds. And we got to 5 seconds, and so it just gave up. I wonder if we can increase that temporarily. Um, Test timeout. Okay, so maybe we can set the test timeout in our vtest config. Trying to find some helpful Stack Overflow posts or something like that. Hmm. Okay, so one thing I'm seeing that might be worth trying here, I'm gonna post it in Zoom chat just so we can see it, would be that we might be able to set an extra duration at the end of the it block. So when we do it displays task list when loading message disappears, that's the first argument, and then the second argument is your async function on line 15. And then your async function ends with the yellow curly brace on line 30. So on line 30, after the second yellow curly brace, could we put like, I don't know, some large number in there, like maybe 11 seconds or something?
You mean on line 30 after the
Yeah, after the
this?
yellow, whatever that is, curly brace. And then we put milliseconds for this test to time out.
Millisecond to be timeout. You mean copy what you have there?
You don't have to copy it
no.
necessarily. We could just put the
70?
number in there directly.
Oops. Hold on. You mean like this?
Yeah, so that would be 70 milliseconds, or we could do times 1,000. Second is a constant that they defined. It doesn't exist.
I don't.
Yeah, that doesn't exist. So you just have to put 3 zeros on the end there yourself, since this is supposed to be milliseconds. So you do 70 and then 3 more zeros. And then 70 is actually like a lot of seconds to wait. Maybe we do like 2 instead of 7 there. So we'll wait for the loading message 10 seconds just to see if it works, and then our test will time out after 20 seconds. And then we need a semicolon after the yellow curly brace on line 30, since it's another argument to our function. Sorry, comma, not a semicolon. There we go. And then hit save and try it again, see if that does anything. Or if it's still gonna time out after 5 seconds. Okay, so it's gonna wait 10 seconds. Okay, so that worked. Can you like quit the test and try it like 2 or 3 more times just to see if it's still flaky? And we'll all just sit here for 10 seconds every time in silence. Cool, 2 for 2. Maybe try it one more time just to see. Cool. Okay, so I guess giving it some more time fixed our problem. And I guess 1.5 seconds was not enough time to consistently load from Airtable. It's a little surprising to me, but generally this is why we set like pretty high timeouts. Just because who knows what's gonna happen. One other thing I want to mention while we're here that might be helpful is it looks like you're using get by ID, which is good. Let me try and find a good link here. This is not helpful. All right, I'm gonna post this link in the Zoom chat as well, and I'll put this on the agenda as helpful.
This is the original one that I had that wouldn't pass, like, about the fire event, and then it's not recognizing the what do you call that? It's not it's expected the test it didn't have it's not haven't it hasn't been called my atom mock.
Okay. Let's come back
It's
to
okay,
this
but
in a
I don't think
second.
I don't think we need to work out. I don't need to have it fixed or something. Just want to show it to you.
Yeah, I think this would be good to see if we can fix in the future, but it's not an urgent priority necessarily. Can we go back to that other test really quick? The one that we were just working on. Yeah, the one that ended on line 30. So what we did is we just increased the timeout to 10 seconds. Sorry, the timeout of the whole test to 20 seconds. And then that line 21 through 23 is literally just sitting and waiting for 10 seconds to make sure that we load all of our text. And that works. But it does require that we sit for 10 seconds every time we run the test, which in reality, like it's not going to take 10 seconds every time. So what we might consider doing for this test to try and make it a little bit better would be to use find by text instead of get by text, which is the link that I just posted in the Zoom chat. But essentially query by and get by, to my knowledge, run immediately. So it's going to check at the exact moment of execution, is this thing present? Which is kind of hard if you have like a component that's changing after a short period of time, like in this case, our text goes away. So what we might be interested in rather, actually, I don't know if this is gonna work. So a find by instead of get by will wait up to a certain amount of time for the element that you're trying to get to be present. So if it's not there right away, it'll wait until it does find it, and then it'll continue your test. And we don't have to always wait 10 seconds. Maybe it's 2 seconds, maybe it's 1 second, maybe it's 3 seconds. But we can still set that timeout for once we give up and just say that the test has failed. So that might be worth subbing in here. It's not going to work exactly because what you're trying to do here is say, I want my loading text to be gone, and then I want my list to be present. You're going to have to swap those around if you want to do this because find by waits for something to show up on the page. So you would have to find by for your to-do list so that it waits for it to be present. At which point your loading text will also be gone because they are like mutually exclusive. It's you're either loading or you have your list. So you wait for your list to show up with find by and then test that your list is there using that expect statement. And then after that, you can get by your loading text, which at that point should be gone. So you don't want to use find by because we're not waiting for it to show up. You'd use get by, and then it would check that your text is on the screen. So that might be a better approach than like what we did here, which is just make it really long. At least for this specific test, I think that would be the better approach. Does that make sense or no?
Not really, but I'll read on the document that you sent me. Thank you.
Okay. All right. That was a lot of testing stuff. Very little context for everyone else, which I apologize for. Anyone have any like testing questions, non-testing questions, anything like that? Anything you'd just like to talk about? Okay. One thing that I was talking about earlier today that I might just do a little mini demo on because I think it's interesting. A topic that I didn't really know anything about until I started at my most recent job. Let me open up our sandbox. Just do the Grackle to do app for a second. All right. So this is kind of related to writing tests. So I apologize for those of you who are sick of me talking about it. So one thing that we've been doing in our applications is making API requests. Actually, can't do this. I'm gonna steal Jenny's code for a second since I've been reviewing this. And I know that you already have the API requests in here. So what you guys did in this most recent week is implement API requests to Airtable. So these are functions that we will call when a specific use effect triggers. So we could have a use effect to fetch data when things initially load, or when we add a to-do, then we call those functions as well. This is good. And for all intents and purposes for this assignment, this is great. Like, you should not do anything differently if this is what you're doing. Awesome. But an interesting thought is that in a really large project, we will probably want to write lots of tests that involve these requests being made in some capacity. So one test that I think would be really helpful for this application, this to-do list, is when I click on a button to delete a to-do, that it does correctly send a request to Airtable to delete the to-do item, and then it comes back and it deletes it locally as well on my computer. And similarly, when I enter my to-do form, it should add a new one to the list. And we can't really decouple that right now from Airtable. So, like, we don't really want to be using our production Airtable database for running a test. We don't want to be adding extra load to this database by sending in a bunch of requests all the time when we automate our tests running, like when we submit our code to GitHub. We don't want, tests that we're writing right now that we don't know are going to work yet to be running on our production database in case something goes horribly wrong. So there's kind of like two interesting ways of doing something like this. We could just leave it, and instead of sending our requests to this particular database, we can use maybe like a development version of the database that's at a different URL. So maybe there's like apidev.airtable.com. And then we could use like an environment variable to swap it out and say, if I'm running my test, then I want to send the request to this URL. Otherwise, I want to send my request to the actual Airtable. And then we can just test our component like we were doing earlier today, where we just render the component to the screen. We try and select all the things we need to select on the page and perform all the actions automatically. And then we test afterwards that everything worked. We would call that an integration test, where we're using all of the real components of the system. Usually you're using all the real components. And we're testing like multiple things interacting with each other. So I'm testing that my add to do form properly sends the request in app.js to Airtable, and then that comes back and it updates my to-do list by adding another item, and that item renders. And so I'm integrating all these different parts together, and I'm starting with the form and ending by checking that my new thing happened. That's great. In a lot of cases, that will be completely sufficient as long as you have like a version that's safe that you can edit, which is what we have in my profession. But in other cases, it's a lot easier rather than trying to set up integration tests that go to like a development environment, which might be different or might not exist at all. And really what we would want is we want to just mock these requests. Mock means don't really do it, do something fake instead. So I would like in a test where I have to add a to-do to start with no to-dos, and then when I add it, now I have one. And then I add another one, and now I have two. And if I can do that twice, That satisfies me. I know that my test works. Setting up your development environment for an integration test is going to be really difficult because then you have to like create those to-dos in advance, run your actual test, and then afterwards, anything you created as part of your test, you have to actually delete from your development database, because otherwise, when you run the test again, well, now it's going to start with multiple to-dos, even though you would expect it to start with none. So there's a lot of extra code involved there to set up and clean up for integration tests, which sometimes is a little overkill for what you're actually trying to do. And rather, another way that we can do this is a design pattern called dependency injection, which is not really anything fancy at all, but it makes writing tests so much easier. So let's create like a random JavaScript file here. And let's just take this function entirely. I'm just going to copy this function. We're going to use this function mostly. We're going to simplify this a little bit. It's going to scream at me a bunch of red squiggles because these things don't exist. So let's say we had this function fetch data, which just fetches our data from some URL. And when that's finished, it's going to come back to us and we're going to do some stuff with it. So in the case of our application, we are fetching from Airtable. But really what I would like to do with my tests is I would like to just write some code that does all the normal things without any crazy setup or teardown procedures that are really complicated. And I just don't want it to actually fetch from Airtable. In my test, I want it to just return something that I expect it to return. So if I fetch data in a test where it should start with no items, then when I call this fetch data, it should just return me no items. Like we don't actually need to call to Airtable. We just want some way to say when this function gets called, just return nothing. Don't do anything. And a great way of doing this is by writing essentially a mock object that we've replaced all the functions with just a do nothing function. And all it's going to do is just return the value we want. So there's a concept of this already in vtest, which we have been talking about. Like you can go in here into the guide section and look at mocking, where what we do is we create a mock function. Like this down here, vi.function, and then we tell it that when I call this function, instead of my fetch data, I just want you to return me something. And so in this test, depending on what I want, I will tell it to return something else. Maybe I want to test, well, what happens if that fetch returns an error? How is my code going to handle that compared to how I would expect? Well, I would need a mock for this fetch data. And in that particular test, I would just return an error rather than returning real data. And maybe in some other tests, I return 3 items. In some, I return 0 items. So again, I don't really want to call this function. I want to replace it with a dummy function that just returns something. And I can tell it what I want it to return for this exact test. So that's why we would use a mock function. A mock function is just a dummy function. It doesn't have any implementation. and it just returns something that we want it to return. But we don't have a great way of replacing this function because it's inside of our component. So I don't have any way right now to replace this fetch data function with that fake function that we wrote. So I could do, vi.function, which creates a mock, and then I could tell it when I call this function, I just want to do this other thing instead. So in this case, I would just want to return nothing, an empty list. This is a mock function. It just does nothing and it returns whatever this function returns instead. But I need some way to actually replace it with this fetch data. So what I would do is I would replace my API requests with a client of sorts. So I could create in my other file here a class, a JavaScript class, which you will not use very often, but you use a class all the time if you were to use TypeScript, because you actually have like meaningful types. But you can create a JavaScript class called Airtable client. And this is a class that it's telling me is never used. I can have a constructor that does something here. Maybe it accepts some data. And sets this dot sum data is equal to sum. So this is when we create our class, which I know we haven't talked about classes. A class is just like a blueprint for an object, and an object you've already used in JavaScript. An object is just a bunch of keys and values. But there is also like a real class concept in JavaScript rather than these objects down here, which are just keys and values. And in a class, we can define methods that I can call. And when I call this method, it's going to do this. So I could down here create a new Airtable client. And say my let client equal new Airtable client, client dot say hi. Comment this out for a second. I'm going to get rid of this constructor since it's not actually doing anything. And if I run this code, this is a quick detour into classes and objects and object-oriented programming. Is it in here? This is index.js, node index.js. Cool. So what this does is it creates an instance of this class, an instance being an object. And this object has this method attached to it that I can call. This is a function that I attach to any object of this type. And what we can do with this is we can declare all of the things that we do, all the things we fetch as methods inside of this class instead. So I can say that fetch data is a method. Can I make it async? I think I can. Fetch data is a method of this class. And I can create a new Airtable client. And then now I can do client.fetch data, and that will return me when I await for it, the data that comes from Airtable. And this is really powerful because now that we have an object where all of these belong, we can instead in our app we can take in properties here. So this is God, stupid prop type validation. I'm so annoyed. I don't know why they decided to make that the default. Is that gonna work? Yeah. Cool. So now we have a property, a client property, and instead of calling fetch data, where did I call it? So we called it in this use effect. We can call client.fetch data, and our client is this object that we created, this instance of an Airtable client. You'll only really need one because you're only using one thing to make Airtable requests. Or you're only making one at a time, or you only need to pass it around, in one place. And we can do this with all of our other Airtable requests as well. And here's the dependency injection part. The dependency injection part is saying this thing that I need to do, that I depend on, this function, I'm going to inject it, which means give it to my component instead of declaring it directly inside my component. So instead of declaring these functions inside where we can't replace them, we declare them somewhere outside in an object, and we just pass the object into our component. And I can pass whatever object I want in here. I can pass this Airtable client, which has all of our actual functions defined, or I can create another class, which is a mock Airtable client. And instead of calling the real fetch data, we declare a fake version of this that just returns some number instead. I don't know. We'll return an empty array to say there's no to-dos here. Why doesn't it like it down here? Oh, that's fine. And so I declare a fake version of this class where all of the functions just do what I want them to do instead. And then I can, when I create my app in my test, so in my app.js, this app, we can pass in a property client. We can create new mock Airtable clients. And if there's anything we need to pass in when we create it, so on and so forth, we can do that. So in our test, we pass it the fake version, which has all the fake functions that we can control. And then in our actual production environment, in our index.main.jsx down here, this is where we render the real app, like when someone's using our site. And here for the client, we would just pass it new Airtable client, the real one. This one has all the functions that really go to Airtable. And then this one has the functions that just, return some value immediately. And this is a really simplified version of this. In reality, your mock Airtable client and your real Airtable client are going to be much bigger. Your real Airtable client, we have just put one thing in there, but we would put all of our other Airtable requests in here too. So fetch data, delete item, get item, create new item. All of those requests would be part of our client. And then inside of our dummy one, well, this is where it's still going to be a little bit more complicated. Because we have to figure out how we're going to actually do these fake function calls. So there's lots of ways of doing this. It depends on the language. At my work, I primarily use Golang. And Golang has a bunch of libraries that can create these mock versions of things for you, just like automatically generate them, and then you don't have to do any work. And that's awesome. I love using that library. It makes things so easy and I don't have to write the code myself. There might be something like that in JavaScript. I honestly don't know. But if there's not, you're going to have to get creative. So we know from our v-test docs that we were looking at, if we go into the mocking section again, where we saw those functions, this vi.function is just a fake function, and we can replace it with the implementation of a real function. So this get latest is something they declare up here. This is a fake version of the function that just does whatever. It does something that's not the real version of this function. We could, potentially do this by creating a bunch of fake functions. So let's say maybe in this test, I want to return nothing. I don't want any to-do items. This is so annoying. Just let me copy and paste you, please. Oh my goodness. All right, we'll just put it down here. So this is our function. When we call this function, it should return no items. And we want this fetch data to do that. Well, we want this method to look exactly like this method from the outside. So this signature, like the definition of this method, it probably can't change. We want our actual application in app.js, we want to be able to call fetch to do, and we don't care whether we passed in the fake version or the real version. We should be able to call both of them, and it should just give us back value. So fetch data in your real one and your fake one both have to look the same, but we could pass in something that would return that nothing or return something else depending on what we want. I don't know what the best way of doing this would be. You could maybe try and do something like your constructor, you pass in your fetch function. And then you'd have like just a variable that belongs to your object. This dot fetch function equal to fetch function. So what this is doing is this is saying, when I create an object, so an instance of this class, this object is going to have the method fetch data, but it also has this property fetch function, which is the thing that I pass in, and it's going to do something. And then we can also call fetch data if we want to. So when I create a new mock Airtable client, I would maybe pass in that vi.function, which is saying for this test, I want you to return nothing. And in a different test, you could pass in, a different thing. So this is some to do with ID of 0. So this would be test for starting with no to-do items. Test for starting with 1 to-do item. So we're creating a fake version, and then we can give it to our app when we actually run our test. So we would have some test here, writing, and then we're running the test. And inside the test, we would create our client. And then we would render app like this. And this would be our test, and then we can expect something here. Oops, I think we're missing. Cool. And so this would be how our tests look now. So we have our test. We create a new mock Airtable client and we tell it this is the function that I want to call instead when I fetch my data. And then over here, we could just call fetch function and return the value of that. So fetch data still exists. It's the exact same function over here. So these clients to our code are exactly the same, but we've replaced the implementation with something that we can just pass in ourselves and change based on the test. This is one way of doing it. I don't know that this is the best way of doing it, to be honest. And like I was trying to convey, like this whole approach of like creating a whole fake version of your client, this is overkill for what you guys are doing here. Like you don't need to be writing any really complicated tests. You don't need to be writing tests at all if you don't want to. I think it's a good exercise. But certainly this app isn't like complex enough to warrant like a really fancy and complicated mock struct. But I think it's a good practice and it sort of shows you the way that you can write a test where we replace those Airtable calls with nothing. And we just return some data automatically, which we don't want to be doing those because it's complicated. It tests more things than we really want to, and it requires a lot of extra work. So this is the concept of dependency injection. It's something that you implement in your real code. So I would design my app.js knowing that I'm going to write some tests for it in the future. And when I'm writing for this for the first time, I would try to write this with a dependency injection format or according to this pattern, where instead of writing my fetch calls in here, I'm going to replace them with an object with methods that do the things that I want. And then I can replace that object with a fake version and pass that in instead during my tests. So this is something that I would think about as I'm writing my code for the first time, so that when I then write my tests, it's really easy and I know exactly what to do. You're not going to get it right on the first try every time, but generally, like, this isn't something that like you write it one way and then you go back later and fix it. This is just something you can adhere to as you're writing your code so that when you get to the testing part, it's really easy. And it's not always about testing either. Like maybe I have like 3 different versions of this client that go to different places. Like maybe I want to, in some cases, fetch from Airtable, but in some cases, fetch from a different database. In that case, I can just pass it in a different client each time. And each client does its own thing and has its own implementations. It's not limited to just your fake one and your real one. There's lots of different cases for this. I think it's a really cool pattern that's like not super hard to grasp once you sort of like get a feel for it, but it's really, really useful. And I think it was cool that my job sort of shoved it down our throats as much as they did. Yes, I can try and give you guys resources. I haven't looked at anything super closely, but some of the links that I've sent out in the past, I will send out here as well. Free Code Camp is usually pretty good. Although this doesn't have any code in it, so I don't really like that. Too crazy either. This uses Axios. Axios is a third-party library that does the same things as Fetch, but I think has a slightly nicer experience than just using Fetch directly. Like it does some things that are designed to make web requests a little easier. I don't think you need to use it over fetch, but you can if you want to. So this might also be interesting and worth looking at. I'm going to leave these in the agenda as well if you want to come back to them. But I've talked enough. We're almost at time. If you have any lasting questions, feel free to stick on and ask them. I know a bunch of people have already left. Otherwise, thanks for letting me ramble to you guys. I promise we'll be done with testing next week and we'll talk about some other stuff. All right, good night, everyone. If you didn't sign in already, please make sure to do so. And then I'll see you guys next week.